Hey everybody, welcome to the Week 10 lecture video for Jesus and the Gospels. In this week's episode, we're covering the Gospel of John. John is the last of the four Gospels that we'll be talking about specifically, and is not one of the synoptics. John is the weirdo of the group of Gospels in the New Testament. We've talked in the last 3 weeks about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how they share similar stories and experiences and parables and teachings of Jesus. And John represents something a little different. Now, this lecture is not going to make much sense to you unless you've read the chapter out of the textbook on John, so make sure you've done that. And after this lecture video, I've posted 2 of those helpful videos from the Bible Project, which may prove useful to you as you understand and unpack this very curious and wildly different gospel. Let's get on with the lecture. The first question that we've been asking about the other Gospels is who wrote the Gospel of John? We're also interested in asking when was it written? Well, John, surprisingly, actually has a lot of debate about who wrote it, when they wrote it, and where they were when they wrote it. So let's look at some sides of that argument. First, church tradition. Tradition says that one of the original 12 disciples, also called apostles, wrote not only the Gospel of John, but the other little letters in the New Testament called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and that pesky book at the end of the Bible called the Revelation. Now, no modern scholar, and really no scholar since the 3rd century, supports this belief. However, it makes sense that if you're just reading through your Bible and you come across the Gospel of John, and then later you come across these little letters at the end of the Bible called 1st John, 2nd John, 3rd John, you reasonably could believe that John, the same guy, wrote all of them. However, we're really sure that the same person did not write all 4 of those books. The vocabulary is too wildly different, the style is different, the content doesn't really line up with each other. But the question is, for us, who wrote the actual Gospel of John? Well, the author of your textbook, I think, chickens out when he's answering this question, and in much the way that he's answered the same question about the previous Gospels. He goes to great lengths to explain to you that modern research has demonstrated that we've been wrong about the authorship for a very long time. And then your author comes back and lands on, well, we really don't have a reason not to believe what the church believed in the 2nd century, so let's just go with that. Well, you're kind of stifling modern research when you do that. You're sort of short-circuiting your own career there, buddy. So what I want to point out in this next slide are some possibilities, and you'll easily be able to detect what I actually think. So first, who did write it? The disciple whom Jesus loved is a character that gets a lot of attention in this gospel. And the gospel itself refers to this person as the author of the book. So we know that at least the person who wrote the book is self-identified in the book. But it seems a bit of a stretch to me and to a significant number of scholars that an uneducated, presumably, Galilean fisherman, or maybe an artisan or a tax collector or something like that, could have sat down at some point after the resurrection and written such a complex text. It just seems a bit far-field. At least in Luke, we have the idea that Luke is a paid author. Theophilus has sponsored him to do this research and to craft this document. In John, tradition says that it was one of the original disciples. Well, remember who the original disciples were. They were low on the totem pole workmen. They were tax collectors and fishermen and all sorts of other commoners. We're not even sure that they could read. So the idea that church tradition got it right just because church tradition is the oldest seems a bit of a stretch for me. I think that our best bet is that a Christian disciple in Jerusalem, who is probably very well educated, or at least familiar with other literary traditions of the era, that's probably our best bet of who wrote this gospel. Now, that does fall in line with what your author seems to conclude, that it's not a gospel for a Greek audience, that the person who wrote the Gospel of John has a staggering amount of knowledge of Judaism, of the geography around Jerusalem and Palestine, and of the traditions of the people and the traditions that Jesus would have participated in. So I think that our best bet is a late first century disciple in Palestine, at least, maybe in Jerusalem, who put down this very curious and well done document called the Gospel of John. Since we're finally talking about the Gospel of John and have moved out of the three synoptic Gospels, we can finally discuss and describe the synoptic problem. Now think way back several weeks ago when we talked about the synoptic problem. You need to remember what that is. The problem is this: if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all so similar, why are they different at all? And since they're so similar, did they use common sources? Which one of them was written first? And now this week we can ask the question, how come John is so different and yet got included in the New Testament anyway? So, on to the big problem with John. So, John is completely different in style and vocabulary and content from the other three Gospels. Now, John does roughly follow the same story as Mark, but that's easy because Mark has very little story in him. I mean, Mark is basically the passion narrative with an extended introduction. So it's not, we're not asking a lot of John to follow Mark's outline. Ooh. So what I want you to remember about John is that the vocabulary is really simple. I mean, he uses basic words. This is not Luke. This is not high quality Greek. It's not high quality literature compared to Luke or even Matthew for that matter. However, the content of it is so dense with meaning and ambiguity that it's actually just a well done and well written document. So John is different in two major ways from the other three synoptic Gospels. First, the sequence of events is different. So Jesus is cleaning out the temple of the money changers towards the end of the synoptic Gospels. But in John, that's sort of the kickoff to his ministry. He cleans out the temple's courts. And also, and this may be more valuable to you, and you might not have ever realized it, in John, there's no parables. It seems like whenever Jesus opens his mouth in the other Gospels, he's talking in parables. He's talking about mustard seeds or lost sheep or a good Samaritan or all these different parables, the vineyards and the talents and all these great stories and great images that we have and make us think about Jesus and about the kingdom of God. John doesn't include any of that, which seems really odd if the other Gospels can be trusted when they say that Jesus always taught in parables. Well, if Jesus always taught in parables, then how come John doesn't include any parables? We're going to address this in just a minute, but I want you to realize the stark difference that means. In John, Jesus is an interviewer, he is a speech giver, he's a philosopher, he's something different than he is in the Synoptic Gospels. John does give us an opportunity to discuss really what I think is the main meat of the synoptic problem. My question to you, and really to the nerds out there who study this for a career, is this really a problem? Is the synoptic problem really a problem? Here's how I want you to address it. If John's version of events is historically accurate, that means if we sit down with the Gospel of John and piece together a timeline of what Jesus said and did, and if we trust that John is telling us the historically accurate truth, then the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are wrong. They get the order of events wrong. And vice versa. If we trust Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then John is wrong. So the question is, who got it right? Well, one of the things I really want you to get from this class is that it's possible that none of the gospel authors were trying to get everything historically right about the teachings and life of Jesus. That when they sat down to write their documents, they weren't concerned with getting the order of Jesus' life events correct. I know that seems like a stretch for us in a society and in a generation that demands accuracy in anything that anything that claims to be nonfiction. But I want you to think about whether or not it really matters to you if if the synoptics are right or if John is right. They could both be right and have completely different stories about Jesus. Just a thought. As a follow-up to that previous slide, I want you to think of the church, especially the early church, we're talking 1st century, 2nd century, as an editor. Remember that when the gospel authors were sitting down to write their books, when Paul was sitting down to write his letters, when the other New Testament authors were sitting down to write their documents, none of them were writing Scripture. Nobody sat down and thought, hey, I'm going to write a document that one day is going to be included in this thing called the New Testament. Nobody sat down and decided that day that they were going to write a part of the Bible. The church came along later and decided what was going to be considered authentic, what was going to be inspired, what bore the marks of what everybody remembered about Jesus, what everybody through prayer and through the community of the Spirit felt that was worthy to be included in the New Testament. So the church, therefore, serves as an editor, not just for the Bible, but I think for specific documents in the Bible too. For example, the Gospel of John. Chapter 21 is obviously a later addition to the Gospel of John. It is written by somebody else. Even the author of your textbook agrees with me on that, and he and I don't agree on a lot. But it is clear that chapter 21 was added after the fact. Also, there's pretty good scholarship out there that says chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, the prologue, was either a hymn that was already being sung in the church, or that it itself was just added onto the front end of John's Gospel by somebody else. The more progressive views, and I think your textbook does a good job dealing with this, suggest that the church that John was writing for edited and polished the entire document for generations until it landed in the New Testament. What I want you to get from that, though, is that the church, the capital C church, received these documents, they believed what they said, but then they edited them as a community of faith before this and other gospels landed in our laps in the 21st century. So if that's true, then what is the purpose of the Gospel of John? Well, I think it's a great example of one of my favorite ideas about the New Testament, that each gospel, especially the Gospel of John, was written by the church for the church. So John's Gospel was written for a specific community, that is, an existing church. It was not written as a competitor or a replacement for the Synoptic Gospels. We don't even really know for 100% sure, 100% certainty, that John even knew the other Gospels existed. That may be an answer to the synoptic problem. that they just didn't know about each other. And then John was writing in such an isolated community that he didn't know about Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So what's the purpose of John's gospel? Well, it is to reinforce and develop the beliefs of a pre-existing Christian community. He's not writing a document and nailing it to the door of some building in Jerusalem or in Corinth or Athens or Rome and hoping to convert some people. No, John is writing a document for a specific Christian community so that they can understand this faith that they've walked into, and yes, so that they can turn around and explain their faith to their neighbors and hopefully lead their neighbors to faith. There are 5 major divisions in John. Your textbook doesn't go into quite as explicit detail, but I think they're pretty clear. First, you have the introduction. That's most of chapter 1, especially verses 1 through 18. Then chapters 2 through 12 is Jesus' ministry among the Jews. 13 through 17 is dedicated to the last night of Jesus' life. 18 through 20 is the passion narrative, that is the arrest, trial, crucifixion, death, burial, and eventually the resurrection in chapter 21. Now, there's also a parallel structure to this gospel that I really like, the way your textbook handled it. You've got the book of glory and the book of signs. These are very well done and part of the great mystery that is the Gospel of John. You've got the I am statements. You've got the 7 big miracles, beginning with the water to wine at Cana. So there's a lot of ways you can break up the content of the Gospel of John. Just from a narrative perspective, though, if we follow Jesus around in his ministry, that last slide on the structure of John is particularly helpful, I think. Especially that section about Jesus' ministry among the Jews, because he's not in Jerusalem the whole time. He's back and forth. He's in Galilee. He's in Israel. He's all over the place. And that's part of the difference of John, that Jesus seems to just go all over the place, not in a nice linear path like he was on a mission. Just like John is unique in structure and vocabulary and content, John is theologically unique and different from the other synoptic gospels. Here are some examples of what I mean. First, John uses dualism as a theme throughout his gospel. Now remember, the vocabulary of John is very simple. He uses words like above and below, and light and dark, and truth and falsehood. These are easy words to put down and to put into sentences and to explain what's going on. But they are not so easy when it comes to explaining really thematically and theologically what's going on. For example, if we just say being born from above and being born from below, well, what in the world does that mean? Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I understand the vocabulary of your sentence, but goodness gracious, what does it mean to be born from above? Hence John chapter 3 with Jesus talking to Nicodemus. We understand easily what light and darkness mean. Light is light and dark is dark. But then when you start talking about people who are living in light and people who are living in darkness, what does that mean? Or even truth versus falsehood. Jesus stands before Pilate in John and says, what is truth? And Jesus becomes a great philosopher in front of the Roman prelate. Well, and that's a really profound question. Jesus was asked, are you the king of the Jews? And he answers with this great profound question, what is truth? Well, I don't know. I was just wondering if I should execute you or not. So the lesson is clear in this dualistic theology. Christians are caught between two worlds that are hostile to each other. Now, we don't know 100% what living as children of the light versus living as children of the dark looks like or means, but man, it's clear that if you're going to be on the side of God in the Gospel of John, then you are caught between these competing forces, light and darkness, truth and falsehood, good and bad, above, below, all these different great themes permeate the Gospel of John. Continuing on this theological theme is how Jesus is presented in the Gospel of John. John is clear from the very beginning of the Gospel that Jesus is in some way of the same stuff or the same personality or the same identity as God the Father and later God the Spirit. So in John, we have probably the first clues to what would eventually be called in the 2nd and 3rd century the Trinity. Remember, the Trinity is an idea that is not in the Bible, but John probably comes the closest when describing the identity of Jesus. So let's contrast that with the Synoptics. In Mark, Jesus seems to be adopted by God at his baptism, that we know nothing about a miraculous birth or any of that stuff. And so all of a sudden Jesus shows up to be baptized by John in the Jordan, and this voice comes from heaven and the Spirit descends upon him, and he seems to be tagged or anointed by God. In Matthew, Jesus is a descendant of Abraham, and so is included in the family of God that way. And in Luke, he's descended from Adam and even from God. And that presents yet another picture of Jesus' identity. But in John, Jesus has always existed. He has always been the right hand of the Father. He is a part of creation. He is the eternal Word. This is really dense theological stuff that is completely different from Matthew and Mark and Luke, and makes John the most densely theological, or at least Christological book of the New Testament. One other theological point that John is very concerned with is the idea of resurrection. Now, the resurrection does in fact show up in all the Gospels, at the end. It's a part of the story of Jesus. But in John, Jesus talks about resurrection in different ways, and resurrection comes to mean something different in John than it does in the Synoptics. Remember, the Gospel of John was written for a community of Christians that already existed. They would have been familiar with the idea of the resurrection of Jesus. After all, it is the resurrection itself that becomes the point of the preaching in the first century. Who in the world would want to believe in Jesus if the end of the story was the crucifixion? So the resurrection is something that would have been at the heart of the story and the heart of the Christian community to which John was writing. So they understand the idea of resurrection. But in John, it's not just an idea of Jesus being raised from the dead. The idea of resurrection is about the believers as well. It is that they have themselves been raised in their present life, and that they themselves will be raised in the future, just like Jesus was raised. So in John, we have this really well-developed idea of resurrection. In the Synoptics, resurrection is something that just happens to Jesus at the end, and is that good news which should be told to everybody that the disciples meet. In John, however, resurrection becomes a theological theme that strengthens and encourages the community of believers, and it actually informs them about what has happened to them because of their faith. This concludes the Week 10 lecture video on the Gospel of John. I hope you've made it through it. What we're going to do now is offer you a quiz. That's all you have to do this week, is finish that quiz. Now, I'm going to warn you now, next week you're going to have a test on the 4 Gospels themselves. So be prepared next week for a little extra work. That's why I'm giving you a little lighter load this week. So next week, be prepared for a test on the Synoptic Gospels and John. Thanks. We'll see you next time.